Oops, sorry, let me check my notes. Great. Uh, Hello again, everyone, and welcome to this session of In Memoriam, a series by Cogist where we remember the lives and legacies of scholars who shaped how we understand mind and cognition. My name is Yunus Şahin, and I'll be your moderator today. Uh, we are here to commemorate the life and work of Daniel Dennett, a philosopher whose influence span across different fields like cognitive science, philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, etc. For many of us, Dennett was a gateway thinker, someone who could challenge, provoke, and inspire us, sometimes all at once. His intellectual rigor, wit, and clarity left a lasting impression on generations of scholars, and his work continues to shape debates about consciousness, free will, and the nature of intelligence. Today, we are honored to be joined by Krzysztof Dolega, a philosopher and cognitive scientist whose research lies at the intersection of consciousness, cognition, and computation. He has completed his PhD under the supervision of Tobias Schlicht, and he is currently working at the Consciousness, Cognition, and Computation Group. His talk today is titled Beyond Illusion, Dennett's View on Consciousness, and we'll focus on a close and charitable reading of Dennett's controversial and often misunderstood position on consciousness. Rather than seeing Dennett as a denier of consciousness, Dolega will argue that Dennett's view offers a powerful alternative to both traditional realism and eliminativism, one that deserves attention. Before we begin, just a couple of brief notes. The session is being recorded and will later be uploaded to our YouTube channel. If you are comfortable and available, we warmly encourage you to turn on your camera. It helps create a more connected and conversational atmosphere. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. In the Q&A session, you will be able to either ask questions directly or drop them in the chat. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Krzysztof Dolega.
Thank you so much. Let me just start sharing my presentation. There we go. Can you see what's going on
Yeah,
there?
it's great.
Perfect. All right, let me just minimize all the windows. Okay, there we go. Great. Thank you so much for this kind introduction and invitation to give this lecture. I feel like I should start by stating what's perhaps obvious and repeating what has already been said here. So Daniel Dennett was very much larger than life. And I must admit that I've never met anyone to whom this expression fit better. He was a true legend in the field of philosophy of mind and cognitive science. But he also had substantial knowledge of many fields outside of philosophy, from biology to programming. And he also had very wide horizons, intellectual horizons, and many varied interests like sculpting and woodworking, to name just a few. And perhaps most importantly, he was also a very kind person. He was very social and was especially generous to young researchers, especially with his time, always welcoming questions and critical discussions of his work. And so it's a great honor to be able to speak in memory of Daniel Dennett in your series of talks, even though I must admit I do feel a bit of unease about lecturing here on his views and my interpretations of his philosophical position. And this unease stems from two things. So, firstly, I think that there are many people more qualified to speak about his work than I am. Some of them are probably in the audience today. Actually, I know they are in the audience today. But the second reason for my unease stems from my personal relationship to Dan. So, as some of you probably know, I've met him during my PhD and have spent some time working under his tutelage at Tufts University. Here's some photographic evidence from my first research. Here I'm with Dan and Teresa Salvato, the coordinator for the Center for Cognitive Science that Dan was the head of. And so the reason for my unease and why I'm talking about this here at the beginning is that in giving this talk, the problem is that Dan was always happy to be consulted and loved discussing things. And he was happy to be consulted on whether or not he would agree with certain formulations or restatements of his views. And this would often lead to many fascinating and very fruitful exchanges between us. And so preparing this talk reminded me not only that I just miss him a lot, but also made me realize that I can no longer get his thumbs up on what I will present here. And so I would like to start with a disclaimer, basically, which is simply that you should take what I say here with a grain of salt. Obviously, you'll be getting things from the second hand here. I'm not the source. But the other reason is that it's important to note that Dennett's views on consciousness evolved over the span of his whole career, and we can spot changes and even some inconsistencies between the different positions he held at different points in time. So it's basically impossible to do justice to his views in a single talk. As you can see here on this slide, Consciousness Explained, which is among Dan's most influential works and is one of the books that probably together with David Chalmers's A Conscious Mind have shaped nascent science of consciousness, has been published in 1991. And there are 22 years between Dennett's first book and Consciousness Science. But then after, and Consciousness Explained, sorry. But after the publication of Consciousness Explained, there's been over 30 years until his final book, in which he was refining and developing his views further. And this basically means that Dennett has spent more time refining his views since the publication of Consciousness Explained than he has had to develop them. And so even though I will focus mostly on what is seen as his received view, I will try to do a kind of blend of introductory talk and some argumentative talk. I will also try to throw some light on his later work that usually does not get as much attention from scholars and that, in my opinion, offers some interesting refinements to his views and hints at potential solutions to the problems that have been leveled against his view of consciousness over the years. Okay. So with all this aside, here's the plan of my talk. I will go about presenting Dennett's views in a way that's structured a bit in a loop or a knot. I will begin by introducing his most controversial claim and present a rather abridged summary of his reasoning behind that claim. Finally, I will return to that controversial claim and see how it holds against some common criticisms. And in the last bit of the talk, I will perhaps present something that is the most interpretive part of what I will say here and is also the most recent advancement in Dan's view on consciousness, or one of the most recent advancements. So, as I said, beginning with Dennett's most controversial claim or dangerous idea, what is it? Well, to know what it is, we have to start where Dennett started. And Dennett began his inquiry into consciousness from a fairly common starting point, namely how things seem to us or what is revealed to us in conscious experience. And according to the analytic tradition in philosophy, at least, what is revealed to us in our phenomenology are the qualitative properties of our experiential states, often referred to as phenomenal properties or qualia. And here's how Dennett explained these properties in one of his most famous articles, Quine in Qualia. Qualia is an unfamiliar term for something that could not be more familiar to each of us, the ways things seem to us. Look at a glass of milk at sunset, the way it looks to you, the particular personal subjective visual quality of the glass of milk is the quale of your visual experience at the moment. The way the milk tastes to you then is another gustatory quale, and how it sounds to you as you swallow is an auditory quale. These various properties of conscious experience are prime examples of qualia. So qualia are simply conscious seemings, the ways in which things appear to us in consciousness, or as Thomas Nagel has famously and colloquially put it, what it's like to have or undergo some conscious experience. And it is these conscious seemings that are usually behind our many problematic intuitions about the mind-body dualism and the hard problem of explaining consciousness in terms of natural science. The reason for this is that qualia, or phenomenal properties, have been analyzed in terms of features that put them firmly outside of the purview of scientific inquiry. And in the same article, Dennett enumerates the features that qualia presumably have. These four features are as follow. Firstly, they are private in the sense that carrying out any interpersonal comparisons of qualia is basically impossible. Whether what I experience as red is the same as what you experience as redness is virtually unknowable according to the received view about phenomenal properties and their privacy. Secondly, they are ineffable in that they cannot be effectively communicated or apprehended by means other than direct experience. They're in this way like jazz. You have to hear it to know what it is. Furthermore, they are the prime examples of what Sellars referred to as the given. They are a kind of raw, direct datum. That is, they are directly or immediately apprehensible in conscious experience, and this exhausts their nature. Uh, and so basically, they're knowable only through this direct, immediate apprehension. And this takes us to the final feature of qualia, the fourth feature which they are supposed to have, which is that they're intrinsic. And they're intrinsic in the sense that they are non-relational properties, so properties which cannot be unpacked or defined in terms of other more familiar properties, like perhaps dispositional or functional properties. And many philosophers, in fact, have criticized this fourfold characterization as either outdated or a kind of a straw man that Dennett builds up for himself, pointing out that few naturalistically minded philosophers today would agree to characterize phenomenal properties or phenomenal experience or consciousness as having all four of these features. And before I move on, I would like to just point out that most philosophers who accept the premises of the hard problem of consciousness as has been defined by David Chalmers, or admit the possibility of philosophical zombies, so perfect physical functional duplicates of me or any one of you that nevertheless lack conscious experiences. Philosophers who accept these arguments seem to subscribe to at least one of the features I enumerated here, namely that phenomenal properties are wholly distinct from functional properties, that they're intrinsic and unlike any other properties that are being investigated by natural science. And the problem with that, furthermore, is that it's not entirely clear whether it is possible to pick and choose only some of the features of qualia that I've enumerated here following Dennett, without in the end falling into embracing all of them. So for anyone interested in this issue, I would recommend Keith Frankish's 2012 article, Quining Diet Qualia, which is a kind of obvious follow-up to Dennett's paper and is a really great paper that presents a kind of dilemma for philosophers, where they either have to accept all of these properties as outlined by Dennett, or they have to reject all of them. There's kind of really no in between. And indeed, Dennett's most famous claim is that qualia defined in this fourfold way are ultimately untenable, and that simply there are no such properties as qualia. And by this, what he means is that we should not give the same ontological status to such properties as we do to more familiar relational, dispositional, or functional properties that populate our scientific theories. And what's important here, and what I would just like to stress, is that, and this is also a point to which I will return later, is that the claim that there are no such properties as qualia, or no such properties as phenomenal properties, understood as these intrinsic, private, and so on properties, is not the same as the denial of consciousness as a real phenomenon that needs to be explained. Since Dennett did not see himself as an eliminativist, and has spent considerable time defending against that accusation throughout his career. So the fact that he denied the existence of qualia or the reality of qualia did not mean that he denied the reality of consciousness as a real natural phenomenon. Okay, but what led him to embrace this radical position of denying phenomenal properties? Well, there seem to be two main lines of reasoning, one methodological, one theoretical. So I'll start with the methodological reasoning and then I'll move on to the theoretical. So Dennett's methodology when it comes to consciousness starts with the unreliability of introspection and the fact that how things seem to us is a poor guide to our psychological reality. Basically, the fact that something seems to us to be a certain way in our minds doesn't mean that that's actually how our minds work. So the problem, as Dan saw it, is that on the one hand, we seem to have absolute authority over how things seem to us, right? If I claim that I see the letters in my presentation here as being purple, none of you can really prove me wrong. You can examine my computer, you can do experiments on me and my visual system, you can test whether there are regularities in how things appear to me on my screen or whether there's something wrong with my ocular system. You could even conclude that my vision is normal and that everything's fine with the connection and the computer. But you could not deny my testimony and would have to explain why I'm claiming that the letters are appearing purple. In this sense, whatever I say is something that I have authority over when it comes to my subjective experience, and it's something that you have to explain, right? I could be lying. That's an explanation of why I claim these letters are purple, which is on par with an explanation that there could be something wrong with my visual system. On the other hand, and that's the kind of second side of the coin when it comes to introspection, introspection is simply highly unreliable. I might be wrong about how things seem to me. The most extreme scenario illustrating this is, of course, Anton syndrome, in which patients with bilateral cortical blindness deny their vision loss and often confabulate about what they see. So to those patients, it seems like they can still see, even though it's obvious that they cannot. So they cannot, for example, navigate physical spaces. They confabulate about properties, visual properties of objects around them when they're asked about them, and so on and so forth. So people with Anton syndrome don't know that they're functionally blind. And so it seems to them like they're blind, right? Their introspection is extremely unreliable. But we don't actually have to even reach such extremes to illustrate this point because we can just consider normal vision. Uh, in our everyday life, we seem to experience the world in full color and detail. It seems to us that our whole field of vision is populated with color qualities, with colors, right? But this might not be the case, and there are now some striking demonstrations of this, which have been inspired, in fact, by what Dennett wrote in Consciousness Explained. So in 2020, Michael Cohen, together with his team, published a study in which they used a virtual reality headset to test how much of people's field of vision can be desaturated into black and white image before they notice the change. So basically, they wanted to see how long it takes for people before they notice that there's no color outside of some limited range of their visual field. So here's the video of what this looks like. Here's a potential participant wearing a VR helmet. Um, Here you have the data that's being collected in the helmet. You can see that gaze fixations are being recorded by the cameras inside of the helmet. And what the researchers did is they tested desaturation within different aperture radiuses. So here you have an example of desaturation where 83% of participants in the experiment were unable to tell that the image is gradually losing color outside of the point of their fixation. And so what Michael and his collaborators did with each consecutive trial, they limited the disk of color that would remain in each trial. So here, as you could see, Before, 65% of participants were unable to tell that color is missing from outside of their foveal vision. Finally, this is an example of a trial where half of the participants were unable to tell that color is missing. Okay. So these results basically demonstrate that introspection should not commit us to how things seem to us. The explanandum in the case of Michael's study is not the richness of color of our visual experience here, but it's the seeming of richness, right? Why do people think that they have constantly access to full color information from the whole visual field when in fact you can remove much of that information and they won't notice? So here's the most striking example. Okay, moving on. So how things seem to us is a poor guide to our psychological reality. And so Dennett proposed that if this is the case, then subjective reports are only authoritative on how things seem to the subject, and researchers should suspend commitment to the entities figuring in the contents of those reports. So subjective reports should basically, according to Dennett, be taken or considered as on par with other scientific measures of behavior, neural activity, and so on. It's just that we should not commit ourselves to whatever seems to the subjects. We, of course, have to record their reports, and we have to track, for example, patterns and changes in their reports over time with different conditions, but we don't have to believe what they say to us. We don't have to immediately accept everything that they say to us as true or committing us to some psychological reality. And this methodology is what he labeled as heterophenomenology. He called this approach heterophenomenology uh, because it's a phenomenology of another, not of oneself. And this is supposed to be a name that is supposed to contrast the heterophenomenological approach, the Dennett's approach, with traditional first-person phenomenology, or as then referred to in some places, lone wolf phenomenology, where we kind of take everything as it is at face value. Okay, so that's the heterophenomenological method is basically the methodology of consciousness science, and it was a methodology that was very much inspired by research into perception and consciousness, and is still basically the default methodology for doing empirical science of consciousness. Let's now turn to the theoretical reasoning behind Dennett's denial of qualia, which can be subdivided into two separate proposals, one negative and one positive. Let's start with the negative claim first. The negative claim is the rejection of what Dennett referred to as Cartesian materialism. So he famously derided what he, through analogy with Descartes' hypothesis about the pineal gland being the seat of the soul and the place where the body interacts with the mind. So he thought that there's a kind of an analog to that view, to the Cartesian view, which he labeled as Cartesian materialism. And in his own words, Cartesian materialism is the view that there is a crucial finish line or boundary somewhere in the brain, marking a place where the order of arrival equals to the order of presentation and experience, because what happens there is what you are conscious of. So he basically denied that there's a place in the brain or a specific module or singular location where information is fed through a kind of a pipeline, just like in this image by Fritz Kahn that you see on the left here, where there's a pipeline, informational pipeline, where things are reaching that point, and the time at which they reach that point is basically equivalent to the time of its presentation in consciousness. And here are two important things or qualifications to this claim. Well, firstly, he did not deny the fact that there is, for example, some temporal or spatial limit for information integration and conscious awareness. So he perfectly understood that there are processes that can be unconscious, and there's a certain limit of time in which processes that are unconscious can be integrated and then enter consciousness. He was also not against separating subliminal from conscious stimulus processing, by appealing to some kind of functional relations in the brain. So something like higher order processing happening or ignition to a global workspace. In fact, Dennett was very much a proponent of the global workspace theory. Yes. Okay, so just to reiterate, he did not mean to deny that there were some functional relationships between different distributed networks or modules that are necessary for conscious behavior to occur. And his rejection of Cartesian materialism, this idea that there's a singular place where information enters and that's how it becomes conscious, comes from his rejection of what he called the myth of the second transduction. And here's a quote, I'm sorry, quite a lengthy quote about how he thought about this. He said, "First, the nervous system transduces light, sound, temperature, and so forth into neural signals, trains of impulses in nerve fibers. And second, in some special central place, it transduces these trains of impulses into some other medium, the medium of consciousness. Today, almost no one working on the mind thinks that there is any such non-physical medium. Strangely enough, though, the idea of a second transduction into some special physical or material medium in some yet to be identified place in the brain continues to beguile unwary theories. It is as if they saw or thought they saw that since peripheral activity in the nervous system was mere sensitivity, there had to be some more central place where the sentience was created, when the mysterious X is added to mere sensitivity to yield sentience." So what he's talking about here as the myth of the double transduction is the idea that in that special place in the Cartesian theater, as he would refer to it, information is somehow imbued in phenomenal properties or is rendered in terms of phenomenal properties, or to use Bloch's metaphor for qualia, where mental paint is applied, and that's what we see in our mind's eyes. So Dennett basically rejected this idea that once information is being processed by the nervous system, it needs to then be reprocessed into something else, into some other kind of physical medium, or some mysterious third kind of information that is non-physical, that then can be, so that it can be experienced by the subject. So knowing what he rejected here, that it's the Cartesian materialism and the myth of the double transduction, what was his positive proposal? And his positive proposal was a view of consciousness which he called the multiple drafts model. And in many ways, Dennett's multiple drafts model bears some similarities to Oliver Selfridge's 1959 cognitive pandemonium model, which was developed as an explanation of how the brain might recognize patterns, particularly in this case, letters and simple shapes. And you have this model depicted on the left. So Selfridge's model imagined different feature matching processes in the brain as what he called demons. And these demons were fighting for control of the system by signaling their answers to other demons downstream. So basically, demons are processes that match patterns, and then they signal these matches to other systems that categorize them. And finally, these demons are signaling their answers with different loudness to the final kind of decision process, the decision demon that produces the output. So this metaphor of demons, of course, if we just look at how the system is supposed to be organized and process information on Selfridge's model, it's not difficult to see how this is a kind of a caricature, a kind of a children's tale about how neural networks process information. And the multiple drafts model of Daniel Dennett is in many ways similar. So multiple drafts model postulates that at any given time, there are multiple information streams that are being elaborated and processed through the brain. And then it replaces Selfridge's metaphor of demons with a metaphor of drafts, like paper drafts, which he also sometimes refers to as content fixations. And we can just understand them as some form of neural representation or information representation of different aspects of the world that are being simultaneously constructed, elaborated, filled, and rewritten, and so on. And so, according to Dennett, there are multiple drafts, the multiple streams of information that are being processed at any given time. And which one of these processes will determine conscious experience depends on its cloud or its kind of ability to take control of the system. He later elaborated that in terms of fame in the brain, that it's the draft that takes control or is the responsible for our conscious experience and our actions is the kind of stream of information that keeps the control of the system for the longest. And that depends on a myriad of different factors, such as the strength of the internal signals, the task demands, attentional modulation, and so forth. Um, and of course, there's a constantly changing landscape of these drafts that are, so to speak, fighting over the control of the system. An important difference I should note here between Dennett's multiple drafts model and the cognitive pandemonium model is that according to Dennett, there's no final decision demon that, you know, um, translates the drafts into some kind of singular output. It's rather that as the strongest draft or the strongest stream of information is basically holding the control of the system as long as it can. Okay, so just to summarize briefly what I said so far. I said that firstly, Dennett's heterophenomenology is a methodological approach according to which consciousness science needs to explain why subjects report certain experiences. And this is why, and why they believe that they have experiences with certain features, right? That's the kind of methodology. Secondly, Dennett rejected the myth of the second transduction, so the idea that there is some special medium or place in the brain in which information needs to be re-represented in order to be imbued with qualia. And finally, he commits himself to a picture of the mind in which at any given point in time there are multiple representational processes that can be poised to determine the contents of conscious experience. And so it's not difficult to see that by making these three commitments, Dennett basically frees himself from the need to accept qualia as part of his ontology. If you accept these three steps, I mean, there are, of course, auxiliary arguments that I'm not mentioning here, but Dennett framed the problem of consciousness in a way where he would not have to commit himself to some kind of mysterious and ineffable and intrinsic properties like qualia. And so it's not difficult why to see, given I hope what I said so far, it's not difficult to see why he rejected them. And of course, this position has been a source of multiple criticisms. So let us move to discuss some of these criticisms. Here are some of Dennett's critics. As you can see, it's really, you can gauge Dennett's influence by who was criticizing him. But there were, of course, many, many other authors who picked fights with Dennett on consciousness. His position on consciousness basically generated a lot of controversy, and some critics have been very, very verbal about their dislike of the view. So John Searle, who isn't included on this slide for I hope what are obvious reasons, wrote in 1997 that he thinks that Dennett's view is a form of intellectual pathology. Galen Strawson in 2018 New York Review of Books article has called Dennett's view on consciousness the silliest claim ever made. And these kinds of criticisms, of course, they're kind of expressions or of some kind or some kind of knee-jerk reactions to Dennett's views, but they're not serious objections to his view. What are the serious objections, I think, which are phrased in a much more charitable way, come from David Chalmers' work, David Chalmers, who was one of Dennett's main sparring partners for the past 30 years, has made a claim that by denying qualia, Dennett is simply denying the explanandum of consciousness science. He's denying something that's obvious and apparent to us, and in this way, he fails at his task. And in fact, I think that some version of David Chalmers's criticism is prevalent throughout the literature and usually takes the form of two worries that are often presented together when Dennett's view is criticized. So these worries would be first, whether Dennett actually explains consciousness or whether, for example, he denies the explanandum, and then whether he denies the existence of consciousness as such. And I think these are slightly distinct worries, so I will try to address them one by one in series. So first, does Dennett explain consciousness? Well, it seems to me that yes, he does, because first of all, as I tried to convey here very briefly, he follows the methodology of empirical science. He tries to give an account of why people seem to think they have certain types of experiences, why they report having certain seemings. Uh, Furthermore, he at least attempts to define the phenomenon in a theory-neutral way, though he is committed to some form of naturalism, and I will say a little bit more about this in a second, because Dennett would often present himself as a very strong reductionist. I think that to some extent that was just influence of his time, that he would be open to certain forms of constitutive explanations, for example, and I will say something interesting maybe about this in a second. But he at least tries to provide an explanandum for consciousness science, the phenomenon that science can explain and can investigate, unlike some kind of intrinsic, ineffable, uncommunicable properties like qualia. And he does offer a non-circular account, right? So he says we have to explain why people have report these seemings, why they think they see things in a certain way. And then he proceeds to do that in terms of mental processes, in terms of providing some kind of a cognitive architecture that's supposed to explain that. So you can, of course, think that his explanation is not very successful, that it's maybe a poor to hand-wavy explanation that lacks detail, but he does try to provide a non-circular account. So I think he does give us at least a very good attempt at explaining consciousness. And I think that when people attack him for not explaining consciousness, I think there are two deeper worries that motivate these kinds of accusations. Firstly, I think that the real problem is that for many critics, the kind of explanation that Dennett offers is somehow unsatisfying. There is no big reveal here. He doesn't explain where the magic happens, where qualia come from, and things like that. But that's just because there was no magic to begin with. It's unsatisfying in the same way that finding out how a magician does the trick is often disappointing. Any scientific explanation of consciousness will have to be, in some sense, boring. And so that's one hidden motivation for claiming that he fails to explain consciousness. I think the other worry, which is somewhat concealed here, is that Dennett doesn't explain what Chalmers referred to as how inanimate matter could give rise to subjective experience. And to some extent, this is a fair point, at least for this talk here, because the multiple drafts model, at least as I presented it here, does not explain the origins of consciousness. But then it does have a story about the evolution of consciousness. Whether this story is compelling is something that I'm not going to speak to here. But again, he does provide an answer to where consciousness came from. It's just, once again, a very boring answer to people who are really interested in qualia. Namely, he thought consciousness is a product of evolution by natural selection. Okay, let's move to the second criticism, whether he denies consciousness. And here I have to say no. As I've mentioned earlier, Dennett has repeatedly defended himself from accusations of eliminating consciousness or having some kind of instrumental approach to it. He thinks consciousness is real, it's a phenomenon out there in the world, and it's an informational process that is realized by or in the brains of creatures like us. He denies that qualia determine what experiences are like, but he does not deny that there is something it is like to be conscious. And I have actually pressed him on this matter in private conversation. So just to reiterate, what he denies is that consciousness should be defined in terms of qualia, and that those are the properties that determine what conscious experiences are like to subjects. But he does not deny that there is something it is like to be a conscious subject. He never denied that Dan Dennett had a singular subjective point of view on the world that is different from my point of view on the world or your point of view on the world, and that being me is something that is quintessentially different from what it was like to be Dan Dennett. And I could stop here, but I think there is a slight problem here. Because if there are no qualia, but it makes sense to say that there's something it is like to be me, and it is different from what it's like to be you, then what determines that difference? So then it cannot appeal to qualia to say that, oh, facts about what it's like to be me are different from facts what it's like to be you. He needs to provide us some kind of answer to this. And I think that actually in one of my favorites of his recent articles, he does provide a compelling story about this. And this is what I will talk for in the next 5 minutes, and then I will done. So in one of his more recent articles from 2018, Dennett proposes a rather interesting solution to this problem that is often overlooked and few people, I feel, have engaged with so far. Namely, he proposed to treat consciousness as a kind of virtual governor. So a governor is, of course, not a not a political position or administrative position. A governor here is meant in engineering terms as a steering subsystem or a control module that can be implemented in some machine or system. Many of you probably know about the Watt governor. Watt governor is an example of a simple steering system. In electrical grid engineering, a system is sometimes said to have a virtual governor when it behaves as if it had a discrete control module, but in fact lacks that module. So a system has a virtual governor when it behaves in a controlled way, as if it had some kind of a control system implemented. But this controlled behavior is just an emergent property of how the system is organized. It's an emergent property of the dynamics and the organization of the system. And this is something that Dennett, when he talks about virtual governors, borrows from Bradley Hooker's influential but also somewhat forgotten trilogy of papers on reductions. So here's the definition that Bradley Hooker provided of what a virtual governor is in 1981. He writes, the property has a virtual governor of reliability F, is a property of the system as a whole, but of none of its components. Virtual governors are reducible only to heterogeneous complexes of mechanisms, hence structures, never to a thing. And I think that by proposing that consciousness could be this kind of virtual governor, then it actually not only uh, brings back one of his greatest inventions, of which I haven't spoken here, which is the notion of a real pattern, but also gives us a very good take on what it would mean to save what it's like talk without committing ourselves to phenomenal properties or qualia. So if consciousness is a virtual governor, what it's like talk picks out states of the consciousness virtual governor. There's a pattern of activity in your brain and my brain and other people's brains that is the virtual consciousness governor, and the pattern and the dynamics of that activity are probably individual and different for each one of us. In this sense, there are facts about what it's like, which are different from the facts about the organization and activities of the components of the underlying systems. There are facts about the virtual governor, like in the quote from Hooker that I presented to you as reliability F, that are not true of any of the parts of the system and yet are true of the whole system. So there is something it is like to be me, there's something it is like to be you, and that property is not a property of any of the components of our bodies. But what's important about virtual governors is that they're just weakly emergent entities. uh, weakly emergent in the sense that they are not metaphysically different or in principle non-deducible from underlying facts. They're just speaking, when we're talking about the system having a virtual governor, we're giving basically a compressed description of the system that allows us to predict and explain its behavior without at the same time committing ourselves to postulating some kind of mysterious properties like phenomenal properties. So virtual governors or consciousness virtual governor would be something that's weakly emergent, that is not metaphysically over and above other familiar properties, but is not deducible from the underlying facts about functional and dispositional properties. Basically, virtual governors are epistemically opaque to us due to the complexity of the underlying processes uh, from which they can be said to emerge in a weak sense. So this would basically bring us back to claiming that consciousness and what it's like to be conscious is, in other words, to instantiate a certain real pattern in the world. Okay, and that's basically, I think, all I wanted to say. I don't really have an explicit conclusion here. What I've tried to do in this talk is to give you a brief run through Dennett's views on consciousness from the received reading to his more recent and obscure work. If there is something I would like you to take away from this talk, it would be this. First, Dennett was not an eliminativist about consciousness, and don't let anyone tell you that. And if anyone wants to claim that, that's fine, but you need to at least present an argument for why we should consider him as one. Um, Secondly, there are some aspects of Dennett's thought that have been neglected, and I would highly recommend looking into his more recent publications. And finally, although I don't think I need to convince you of this, I just wanted to state that he was a really great thinker, and his intellectual presence, as well as his plain human decency, are qualities that will be missed, especially today with everything that's going on around the world. So just a few recommendations. Here are on the left, you see papers by Dennett that I think have been overlooked in the last 10 years, I guess. Some of them are really some of my favorite writings of Dennett on consciousness. And on the right, I provide you with two quite recent papers on Dennett. I highly recommend, especially the most recent of them, Taylor's Consciousness Interpreted in Philosophical Psychology, which I think provides an extremely clear and comprehensive overview of Dennett's views. Okay, thank you. In case you would like to get in touch with me, here's my contact information, and here are the people who pay me for doing my research. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Dolega, for such a thoughtful and inspiring talk. It's not easy to do justice to Dennis' complex legacy, and yet you have helped us see why his ideas still matter. Um, we'll now open the floor for questions and discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, please click the raise hand button in the Zoom reactions menu. I'll call on you in order. When it's your turn, feel free to unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you like. You can also type your question in the chat, and I'll be happy to read it aloud. And I'm seeing hands right now. I think Keith
Should I,
Frankish is the first, and then Cenker.
should I stop sharing my presentation, by the way? Sorry.
I think that would be better. If need be, we
Okay.
can reopen it.
All right. Perfect. Good. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Hi, Krzysztof. First, thanks for that. I thought it was fantastic. Did a really good job of covering a lot of, as you say, uh, the nuances in Dennett's views and how they evolved. I'd like to come to what you talked about at the end. I think the task for those of us who are trying to continue Dennett's work in this area is to develop a more robust account of what qualia talk or what it's like talk is actually tracking. Okay, so it's not tracking these mysterious, ineffable, non-functional properties. So what is it tracking? It's not doing nothing, I think. And I think there are all sorts of hints in Dennett's work. We could talk about those another time, but the one you picked up on there was the virtual governor one. That's from I think you're referring to the hard question paper from facing up to the hard question paper, which is a nice paper. And of course, the hard question is at the root of Dennett's thinking about consciousness. And then what happens? This is one reason why this idea of entry into consciousness was one that he disliked, because okay, something enters consciousness. Well, what does that amount to? What's the cash value of it entering into consciousness? What difference does it make? And there we have to give some account in terms of, I guess, its effects. And now your suggestion is that what we're tracking there with talk about the field of experience are states of this virtual governor. Okay, that's interesting. What kind of states are? What are we? I mean, the virtual governor is, I guess, doing the sort of things that the homunculus will be supposed to do, reacting to stimuli in different ways. So, which features of that activity, the activity of this virtual system? When I say, for instance, that something like there's a bright red color there, and it has its distinctive feel of bright red. What activity of the virtual governor am I referring to there? Am I gesturing at?
Okay. Thank you, Keith. That's, of course, as always, on point. Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and this is a question that I'm still thinking about. So I maybe will try to answer this in a kind of a roundabout way, if you don't mind. Um, so what I would like to say here, I guess, what I'm trying to suggest when I'm gesturing at this idea of virtual governor, that, he presented very briefly in that paper. So that paper, he's mixing and matching metaphors a little bit in that paper, because he's also talking about virtual paint, and talking about the user illusion. I wanted very briefly to talk about the user illusion, but the user illusion seems to be something different from the virtual governor. And so I would say, so my claim is, I think what I want to, when I'm thinking about this, well, how I would develop this idea of the virtual governor is, I think I would make some kind of a claim that when we're talking about virtual governors, we're creating a kind of we're latching on to something that's happening in the system, right? Because it helps us, talking about consciousness somehow helps us, and talking about our qualitative aspects of our experience helps us predict how I will behave, right? How we will behave. Like, I cannot see whether, you can see whether I have a stomach ache right now or not. And there are no apparent there might be no apparent symptoms of the fact that I'm having a stomach ache. But if you know that I have a stomach ache, that allows you to predict my behavior in many reliable ways, right? And the same way, you can predict your own behavior in this way, and you can also optimize your behavior in certain ways. So if you know, for example, that certain dish will cause in you an unpleasant sensation, that will allow you to not eat that dish in the future, and so on and so forth. And so I think that the way I would try to cash this out is actually in some kind of terms of an epistemic talk of these properties. So I think it might be worth to separate these two issues here. So virtual governors are not really something that we talk about because we want to understand the parts of the system exactly. It's something that we talk about because we want to explain or predict behavior of the system. Just like what Dennett would say often about real patterns. Real patterns, of course, have to latch onto something in the actual system. But the things that they latch onto in the actual system don't have to look anything like the real patterns themselves and so on, right? So they're compressed descriptions of the systems. And in such way, real patterns are in some way a heuristic for describing the system in some sense. Not an accurate description of the system as it can be decomposed and so on and so forth. And so maybe I would try to say something like this, that when there's a certain property, when we talk about certain kind of phenomenal experience of redness, let's say, what we're really doing is we're giving this kind of taking an epistemic handle basically on what's happening in your visual system and how what's happening in your visual system will impact your behavior and your future reactions to the stimulus. But we're not actually revealing anything concrete about how the visual system processes redness, right? It's just a kind of a description of how it happens. And yeah, so that's one thing that I would probably want to say about this. And then if I say this, you might say, well, that sounds very instrumental. And to that, I would have to again appeal to real patterns and say that, well, real patterns exist or can be described whether or not there's anyone to observe them in a sense, which then, of course, brings us to the problem of the fact that qualia are supposed to be first person apprehensible. And then I must say that this is a point at which, I kind of tend to run ashore because I'm interested very much in combining the user illusion metaphor with this idea of a virtual governor, but I haven't exactly worked it out in detail how it could be done.
Thanks, Krzysztof. There's a lot there that I like, and which I'd like to maybe we can talk about in some other venue. But no, I really like this, and maybe it's just interesting to note that this is one thing that Dan was very good at was suggestions like that. As you say, the virtual governor thing is there's just a little, it's just I think a paragraph in that paper, but he was so good at raising ideas. Maybe it could be like that, and then being generous in letting others take those ideas and run with them. It was part of his generosity that he would throw, and he had such a fertile mind, and I just think that's another thing we should be grateful for. And another way, and though of course we all miss him, he's still there offering suggestions through all of the text, wonderful texts he left us. And so there's so much to mine in his work and so much to do to continue his legacy.
I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. I think that he will outlive us all probably in his writings because there's so much there. There's so much richness. And you're completely also right that one of the best things about, I think, and you will probably confirm this as well, in interacting with him was that he would have suggestions that you would never encounter by talking to anyone else in your field because he was just interested in so many things and he touched on so many different topics during his lifetime that he really had always some interesting suggestions and he would always point you in directions where you wouldn't usually look for answers, which I think was one of his best qualities as a scholar.
Thanks. Cenkar, please go ahead, and then Tobias.
I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Still nothing.
Maybe we can. Is that okay? No, we can't hear you. Okay, maybe uh, while you are trying to fix it, Tobias, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. But you can hear me? Okay. Yeah, thank you, Chris, for a very nice talk and overview. I was wondering, because picking on the last point also with the governor, but the question you raised before that was how we are all different and how our consciousness or points of view are all different based on the tools that he has in his theory. And I was wondering, because I didn't get that, because if the governor boils down to an assembly of mechanisms, then they would be the result of evolution as well, and they would be equal or not, would not explain the difference in us or between us. I was wondering whether I don't know, I know you don't like the theory of memes very much, but wouldn't that have to be added to make sense of that? So just to annoy you, sorry.
No. It's a fair point, and I think that yeah, you're right. So now the cat is out of the bag. I'm not a big fan of Dennett's flirtation with memes, but I do think that it's again a kind of a metaphor that conveys something very interesting. So a simple fact that makes us all different is that first of all, even though we're members of the same species, there are dramatic differences in our neural structures, and there are dramatic, so our kind of physical composition, and there are dramatic differences in our histories, right? So how we came to be shaped in the way that we are. And so I think that this kind of developmental story is something that Dennett would very much endorse. The fact that basically what makes your point of view on the world, Tobias, different from mine is not just that I'm locked in a room and you're outside looking at nature, but but it's also the fact that we have two completely different developmental trajectories. We've been, so to speak, programmed and shaped by different environments. We came into the world with different genetic makeups, and all these kind of degrees of freedom, I think they allow us to they could allow us, and I think Dennett would say that they allow us actually to spell out the differences between individual perspectives on the world, and why my subjective experience of redness is maybe slightly different from your subjective experience of redness, and why I like this type of wine and you don't like that type of wine, and so on and so forth. I think what I'm trying to get here with the pointing at the story with the virtual governors is that basically there is some kind of totality of facts about our physical organization and our causal histories with the world that could perfectly explain the differences between us. The problem is that this totality of facts is so huge that there's no way we can grasp it in any way, because we would have to perhaps to understand perfectly what makes Tobias tick, or what makes Yunus or Keith respond in a certain way to one particular stimulation would maybe require us to, model the whole history of your development and so on, and all your interactions, past interactions with similar stimuli. And that's just something that we will never be able to do just because of the computational complexity of that task. So I think that there is something to be said about this idea of trying to get a compressed handle on what's happening in our heads. And I think this is also in line with other parts of Dennett's view, right? Like the intentional stance, for example.
I mean, if I could add one
Yeah,
last.
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
So even in his theory of memes, and as he presents it, I think sometimes there's something that is not highlighted that is highlighted in other places, that may be important for his philosophy. And I would invite Keith to comment or to prove or not. That is the role of intersubjectivity. For like when he talks about the self, he's always talking in terms of a center of narrative gravity, but we are not authors or initiators of some kind of story, but we are the stories that spin us. I think that's a close quote to something from Consciousness Explained. So it's always like that he wanted to emphasize the kind of narratives that we are embedded in, that and that we are sort of that make up our self or what we are, and so that only arises in intersubjective contexts. And of course, intentional stance is always also an intersubjectivist theory, because to have a mental state is to be predicted by someone or something like that, or to be explained or attributed by someone. So that is sometimes I think he didn't sort of really press on this in a book or in a certain paper devoted to it, but it's everywhere, sort of scattered throughout this view. I wonder, I mean, it changes the view or the viewpoint on consciousness from perspective of the heart problem, because um, yeah, it adds a different twist to it, I think.
Right. I don't know if Keith wants to say something about this, but what I can say just about this is just, yeah, I think I would also fully embrace that, right? So there are these cultural narratives that are floating around. And of course, they are part of what shapes how we think and how we reason and how we engage with the world. And it's not just about the physical facts of our makeup, but I also assume that the informational environment is part of what shapes us and what makes us individuals, right? The fact that each one of us has this individual trajectory, not only through the physical spaces that we have occupied in the past, but also through the, let's call them idea spaces or informational space, right? And I think all these things fit pretty neatly together in Dan's view.
I won't. There are other people wanting to comment, so to questions, so I won't say much. But just you didn't mention the Joycean machine here and the role of language in creating this inner space. And I there's a that's a big theme in Dennett's work. And there's the multiple draft story, but there's also the Joycean machine story in the same book. And the relation between them, I don't think it's never been completely clear to me, but it certainly needs investigation. But I think Dan became Dan reiterated his commitment to the value of meme theory in from bacteria to Bach and Back. So I think we have to take that if we're interested in developing the ideas that Dan had. But anyway, we can talk about this another time.
Thanks again, Cenker. Let's try it again.
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Hello again, and thanks for the amazing presentation. So you've talked about Dennett being fond of GWT, right? So the global workspace theory. I was wondering, since a lot of the proponents for these kind of models, whether it be IIT, GWT, or some other criticality-based smaller network topographically based models, try to employ the ideas of philosophers such as like Dennett and use his suggestions. I was thinking, is it viable or is it even applicable to also use as ideas such as like the multiple draft theory to integrate into the, for example, IIT or those topographically foundational models? Or does it even make sense to talk about these in terms of models per se?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. So I did not elaborate on that because I was trying to take as few detours as possible in my talk. But yeah, so Dan was a proponent of global workspace theory, and I think one of the reasons of that is because I would not, for example, describe global workspace as a topographical theory, right? It's rather like a functional theory. So the idea is that it's about the functional relations between different modules and how information is shared between them. And so what was attractive, I think, for him in global workspace theory in the context of multiple drafts model is that in global workspace, when we're talking about ignition into the global workspace, we're not really talking about sending something. Well, we're not talking about moving things from one place to another, right? Things can stay, and there are some elaborations of the global workspace theory. Information can be still processed in a module. It's just that it's accessible to other parts of the system, basically. And I think that's what he found attractive about the global workspace. And of course, the idea of these unconscious or preconscious streams of information which are being elaborated, right, and can then enter consciousness and so on. Okay. Now, whether we can apply his ideas to something like IIT, to these topographical views, which assume that there's a certain structure of things that needs to be in place. Well, I think there's kind of two ways to go about this. So I'm pretty sure that he would want to not he wouldn't want to, be applied to IIT as it stands currently, just because of the premises with which IIT starts and how it characterizes consciousness. Basically, IIT starts from a different point than I think Dennett started, and I don't think he would accept some of these. I don't remember what they call them, the premises or the auxiliary assumptions of the view principles. So I don't think he would subscribe to some, if not all of them. But there is something that I think he would be okay with when it comes to mapping what people sometimes call as phenomenal spaces these days. So this idea that, for example, you can have a multi-dimensional space in which you register different types of sensations, and then you explain the apparent qualitative differences between sensations in terms of their locations and their distances to other sensations, right? So where they are located in that space. And I think that's something that I actually pressed Dan last time I saw him live on this a little bit, because this is something similar to what David Rosenthal called qualitative spaces. And David Rosenthal is very clear about the fact that when he talks about qualitative spaces, he doesn't want to talk about qualia. He wants to actually reclaim the word qualitative from the hands of people who have equated it with phenomenal properties. And he basically says that, well, you can construct these spaces in which you register different sensations, and then you can explain your reactions to certain sensations, for example, in terms of how they relate to other sensations that you registered in that space. So I think this kind of mapping project would not be something that he would be opposed to, as long as it wouldn't be described in terms of mapping qualia, right? He would probably prefer to talk about discriminations or something like that. But the idea that there are relations between different types of sensations and how a sensation feels to you depends on its relation to other sensations you've had in the past. That's something that's, I think, very close to some ideas that he has explored at some point, at least. And there's nothing problematic or mysterious about that, right? Because then we're talking about relational properties. We're not talking about some kind of intrinsic properties of qualia or something like that.
Thank you so much.
If I'm not mistaken, it's your turn, Nicola.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Thank you. So fantastic lecture. So thank you very much. It was super informative. And my question is actually about what you just said, Chris, about the mapping between qualia and or perhaps qualia and certain physical properties. Because my question is exactly that. Why can there be a mapping between certain properties, for example, of the governor and the qualia themselves? Why can't we hold on to qualia and say, like, perhaps there are these properties that have these properties, being intrinsic, ineffable, or whatever. And here I have the properties of my virtual governor. And this property of the virtual governor explain why qualia is intrinsic. This property explain why it is ineffable. Why can't I have this mapping that, in a certain sense, would still, leave qualia there? You explain. You kind of reduce qualia, so you're not saying that they are mysterious or anything, but you don't really need to get rid of them either, right? So it's just more of a reduction. Why is that not a possible strategy?
So this is a very good question, Nicola. Thank you so much. So there was a point in time when I wanted to write a very provocative paper in which I wanted to ask, the paper would be titled, "Is Dan Dennett a non-reductive physicalist?" And basically, you just outlined more or less the argument of that paper, something like that, right? And I think so. Maybe I should qualify what I said here about the phenomenal mapping phenomenal spaces or something like that, because people will maybe get a wrong impression of that. So you can, of course, describe certain regularities in the virtual governor, right? So there's these, let's say that phenomenal properties are virtual properties, and you can map the relations between them, basically. You can map some kind of regularities between them, and you can stop at that, right? And you can say, like, look, there are these interesting regularities here. They help us somehow predict how the system behaves. So you can do this kind of elaboration of the virtual governor. And I think that's fine. Actually, I think that would be an interesting project to do. The problem is that there's no reason why these structures that you will map will have to match onto anything that's going on in the physical system, according to this picture. So it's only if you would be able to, in a very convincing way, explain, right, or show that the relational properties between the properties of the virtual governor are somehow represented with the same preservation of, I don't know, some kind of second order homomorphisms or something like that between isomorphisms, sorry, second order isomorphisms between parts of the system, that we would get some kind of an interesting result in relationship to how the brain works. And now the problem, I think, with that is that once you've showed that, I'm not entirely sure that you can still hold on to, this claim that qualia are intrinsic and so on and so forth. Because basically what you did is, if you show that there's some kind of a mapping, you have shown that these properties can be elaborated in terms of relational properties and functional relationships between physical entities, right, in the brain, between processes in the brain, and how they unfold over time. And so at that point, I don't think you need to still talk about qualia in the way that people usually think about qualia, because at that point, the job is done. You've kind of explained away everything that there was to be explained. And you've provided a description of, why, I don't know, I behave in one way when I eat chili peppers, but I behave in a different way when I'm eating flaming hot Cheetos or something like that. And it's yet a different way when I'm eating something else that's also spicy. And so I think that at that point, there would be nothing left from the initial assumption about qualia that we would want to preserve. And I think that's what Dennett would say. Like, at some point, you just say, okay, and this is what it is. This is how it works. And so you can get rid of, you can let go of this, mythical creature of qualia. And then you just have you have a property, I don't know, tasting water refers to this process in the brain, right? So you've kind of successfully completed a reduction. I'm very skeptical whether this kind of reduction is possible, actually, but I don't know if this answers your question. I also have a feeling that probably you know more about structural theories of consciousness than I do.
No, I think that the only thing would be like, for example, with water, if once we explain all the chemical properties of water, we still say, okay, but it's still transparent, it's still liquid, we still use certain terms that refer to, properties of water without saying that we have eliminated them, right? I think that would be like a similar.
Okay.
But
No, that's a good point. So let me maybe also just respond to that briefly. I'm sorry, Maria, that you're waiting in the queue for so long. So water maybe was not a good example. Think about colors. So I think that if you, and maybe I'm wrong about this, maybe Keith can correct me, but I think that, like, if you ask Dan about colors and whether colors exist, he would probably say something like, well, they're a useful fiction, something like that, right? Their colors are virtual properties because they're neither here nor there. And they actually, if there were no creatures with vision and minds, there would be no colors in the world, right? At the same time, colors, there's a big problem with reducing colors to just one simple set of physical properties, right? And we know that colors, there's no one property of redness, for example. There's actually a plethora of different properties that change contextually and change from observer to observer and so on and so forth. And so when we talk about colors, we're really talking about something that's in this sense virtual, is in a sense a virtual property of how we interact with the world, but it's not something, it's neither inside of us, but it's also not outside of us, because colors are not objective properties of the surface light reflectance properties, right? So I think this is maybe this would be maybe something, a way where we could hopefully understand what Dan would say to something like this. He would just probably say that, well, you would still keep talking about your feelings, even if we knew everything about emotions, right? Um, this is just part of our psychological makeup and how we work. Uh, but that doesn't mean that there's something mysterious about feelings that we, in principle, can never explain. It's just that the way we think and interact as minded creatures with each other is such that we just occupy this kind of user illusion by which we have a handle on these physical processes.
Thank you. Thank you. Super helpful.
Thank you. Maria Luisa, please.
Hello, thanks for the amazing lecture. So Chris, do you think that the visual governor could be somehow related to the cybernetic good regulator? Because if so, there might be a way to connect the user illusion to this governor that would be to control the body for survival and word interaction and so on. I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, when I was looking for something to show on the slide while I was talking about virtual governor, just to make the slide a little bit more interesting, I was looking at cybernetic loops, and I was thinking of that. So I do think that there is definitely a strong influence of cybernetics in Dennett's thinking, and he was actually a big fan of a quote from Norbert Wiener, in which he said that I'm paraphrasing now, so forgive me for that, but you can find it online, but Wiener basically said that any type of materialism that cannot make sense of the fact that information is neither energy nor matter is not a serious materialism or something like that. And so he definitely read cyberneticists and he was definitely interested in that stuff. And so the good regulator theorem. So there is a view on consciousness, which is Michael Graziano's attentional schema theory, which has this more or less this vibe of postulating that there's some kind of a control model inside of the system, inside of our brain. And this control model distorts how things are processed. It creates this kind of useful fiction that it then uses to deploy attention and bias different processes and basically control the system, right? So Michael Graziano's attentional schema theory, I think, is a kind of a way to do that. I know that Dan was familiar with it and was okay with the attentional schema theory. Preparing this talk, I was thinking actually about this, about, well, how close does Michael Graziano's the idea of an attentional schema come to something like the Cartesian theater a little bit? Because it does seem that, information needs to be re-represented in this control model in order for it to be conscious. And then there might be some claims about the fact that, well, maybe the timing of when things are represented by that model is tied directly to when things become conscious and so on. So a little bit unsure these days about whether Dennett would wholesale subscribe to Michael Graziano's view. And I know that Michael Graziano has for a long time also rejected the label of illusionism. From what I heard recently, he has finally embraced illusionism in one of his more recent papers. But that was, I think, something that took almost a decade to happen. So yeah, I'm sure you could elaborate some of Dan's passages and unpack them uh, through Graziano's ideas. I'm not entirely always sure about how he thinks of the attentional schema. So the problem for me is that I understand what the attentional schema, according to Graziano, is supposed to be doing. I'm just always a little bit puzzled about how it's supposed to be doing it. So I'm sure there's a way to unpack it in a way that would be compatible with Dennett's views, but I also see an opposite path where it could be a restatement of some kind of more robust higher order theory that maybe Dan would not want to align himself with. I don't know if this is a satisfying answer, but
Oh, yeah, sure. But when I was talking about the good regulator, I was thinking more on the Bayesian world of predictive processing theories. So not exactly on Graziano's theory. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense from
okay.
this point of view.
So just to be clear about the predictive processing side of things, the most recent work from people who are working on predictive processing and are interested in consciousness is postulating some kind of holographic screen on which information is projected. And I don't know enough about physics and all the formal machinery that they're employing there. But I am somewhat skeptical of this being a kind of, Cartesian theater once again. So this kind of holographic principle. I'm not entirely, I can't claim that I completely understand it. So maybe I should be as charitable as possible. But there's something that smells a bit of reinventing the Cartesian theater in that for me.
Yeah, I think they've written about this uh, neo-Cartesianism thing already, but this is the fringe part of predictive processing framework. I mean,
I mean, I don't know what's the fringe part of predictive processing anymore, but I just wanted to point out that Keith wrote in a direct message to me that actually he doesn't think that Dan would say that about colors, that they're virtual properties. And I think Keith might be right. So I don't remember now what Dan exactly said about colors in Consciousness Explained. I know that there's an extended passage about colors and evolution of color in Consciousness Explained that is often also misunderstood by people who comment on it. But I think Keith is right because I remember having some kind of conversation with Dan where I was trying to get him to understand, to get him to agree with me that colors don't exist. And he was very, very opposed to that idea. And he was very much subscribing to the idea that colors are real. But unfortunately, I don't remember the details. So maybe Keith, if you can elaborate, that would be useful.
Well, just briefly, I think other people are wanting to ask questions, but yes, my understanding is that he was a mild realist about colors considered as properties of external objects. He would have said colors are like the cuteness of babies. So they're features of the object, but they are identified by the reactions they produce in us. So what unifies all the different physical properties that count as yellow is that they produce the yellow, the yellow response in us, just as what unifies all the features of babies that are cute is that they make us go, ooh, oh, coochie, this sort of thing. So his standard line was colors are real properties of objects, but not what we think they are. So I want to ask him how come he could be realist, so robustly, well, not too robustly, mildly realist, at least about colors, but not about qualia. Why not say the same about qualia? And I asked him, here's my hypothesis. It's that once you have colors, once you're a mild realist about colors, considered as properties of external objects, you don't need to have qualia as well. You can just have a manifest image in which the world is populated with colors, which aren't what they seem to be, in terms of being pure unstructured qualitative properties of surfaces. And then you don't need to make Galileo's move of relocating these qualities that science tells us aren't really there in the world into the head. So you just say, no, colors are out there and they're not what you think they are. I think that's pretty much his. As always done, was exploratory. So there were one of the risks of interpreting Dan is assuming that he had that behind his remarks was a worked out commitment to a detailed position. He was much more exploratory. He was trying to get us to see things in productive ways that we could then explore, rather than nailing down. He talked about meanwhileism, a view that's a good one to have until empirical work motivates a better taxonomy. So he was trying to point us down the right roads rather than telling us that he got the finished theory.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a much better reconstruction than what I attempted. Thanks a lot. Oh, Keith, we can't hear you if you said something.
I just said we could talk more about it.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, once again. I think that's pretty much it. Chris, if you're okay, maybe we can say goodbye. I don't know. Maybe.
If I can, I would just like to thank you for organizing this talk and to thank everyone for coming to this talk and for a very productive and interesting discussion. So thanks a lot.
Thank you once again for your time and contribution and for helping us engage with Dennett's work in a way that was both critical and appreciative. And thank you to everyone here with us today. Your presence made this not just a talk, but a shared moment of reflection and a tribute. If you'd like to stay informed about future sessions, future events of Cogist, feel free to follow us on social media or join our mailing list. And until next time, take care. See you.
Thanks a lot. Bye bye.